It's so good to be back at the Goose. I took a year off to hang out with Bishop Yvette Flunder last year, and it was also hot in Phoenix like it is today. But I'm so glad to be here with pastors, with academicians, with people who are trying to follow Jesus in the small things. And we have a driving question for this session, which is, what is next for the church? Where do we go from here? We see a rise in white Christian nationalism. We see a rise in anti-difference theologies. And the church, many people say, is fading away or dying. But many of us are part of alternative spiritual communities called the church that has life. And so I'm wondering if each of you could speak about what's next for the church. How do we follow Jesus at the end of empire? What does it mean to do and be church at this time?
Ladies first.
They pull the ladies first card. Well, thank you for that question. I spend a lot of time thinking about this. Thinking about it in the framework that you have offered, and thinking about it in some other ways as well. I think what concerns me the most is not just what's next for the church, but what's next for this church. We are in a time where we are living in the product of decade-long strategies around quote-unquote conservative faith. And I find myself struggling for the unified voice of progressive faith. We come to places like this and others, and we're very good at talking about what is wrong with what other people are doing. I'm just being candid. But I don't yet hear an articulation, a clear articulation that is communally translated of what we are for and what we're going to do in this moment that is different. I'm concerned about the abdication of language, the running away from being church, the running away from being identified as Christian, because there are unholy things happening in a holy name, right? But I'm concerned that we run instead of stand and claim. I'm concerned about the abdication of language, that we have become comfortable being called left of the gospel. And we too collude with the implication of saying someone is right of the gospel, the religious right, the left, when actually the gospel is just the gospel. And I would suggest to us that the core messages of the gospel align with the messages that are now being labeled progressive faith. So what we are experiencing is an inversion of an understanding of what it means to be followers of the way. And now what was centered to that has become or is becoming the fringes of that. And our solution is to say, well, we're not that, we're something else. Instead of creating a communal voice and a cohesive voice, not that we have to all think the same way, that's not what I'm saying, but a collective voice that says this is who we are and we are entitled to be it, and we are courageous enough to confront things that are not it. It is a difference in what we do right now. So if you are presenting to me something that is not characteristic of the ministry of Jesus, not what I think, is not characteristic of the ministry of Jesus, then I'm going to say to you, I don't know that Jesus. If what you are presenting is not in the nature of God, if it's not loving, God is love, then I'm going to say to you, I don't know that God. Where is the courage of the progressive faith, if we want to call ourselves that, to stake equal ownership and from a place of what we are for and not just what we are against. That may not make sense, but this is a thinking space. So that's my wrestle. What are we for? Not just what are we against. And how are we living out what we are for in ways that are generative and nurturing and that draws to us people who are looking for places that are well nourished by God's love. I am a Christian. I am a follower of Jesus Christ. And I'm not ashamed of that. And I'm not going to denounce that. And at the same time, I am not going to abdicate my language to what I don't see as the ministry of Christ.
I want to hear from others, but I just want to say, Tracy, thank you for naming the material need of a Christian faith. I've been thinking for years with people about how do we get out of the oppositional politics, this us against them. And so I'm wondering, Reggie, I know that you've spent a lot of time with Bonhoeffer, and we're about to read Bonhoeffer over the next year and a half, because we think there is something salient there for our moment. And I'm wondering, can you speak into some of the insights that you've learned from Bonhoeffer as what is next for the church? How do we be this communal body that is trying to be faithful in the small things?
Well, thank you for that question. And, it's always... I want to say Reverend Blackmon asked me to come and preach at her church once. It was not a friendly move to stand in her pulpit. This is one of the most phenomenal preachers on the planet. If I must say, one of the most phenomenal and amazing pastors as well. I say that every time I get to talk about Traci Blackmon. So to be able to sit next to you, dear sister, is amazing. And to have this conversation. I would love for most, if not all of us here to be sitting here asking this question, where do we go from here? Because it is the question. And it's not the first time that this question has been asked, of course. But in response to your question, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the book that I wrote about him is in relationship to his time in the United States as a postgraduate student and what that did for him and how he was able to see clearly see earlier, once he went back to Germany, the Nazis as a problem, specifically because of the racial stuff. As it relates to what we're talking about here, one might say that he's concerned that Christians failed their most significant problem, the most significant challenge. They failed at the most significant challenge of the faith in the history of Germany. In that moment, they did not just not respond, but as David was saying earlier up here, many of them did respond awfully. And he's upset, and he's reaching out in different spaces, including the United States, including India with Gandhi, in various spaces, to figure out how to help have a Christianity after Hitler. That's one of the things that they were doing, that he was doing, trying to write a theology and present a kind of faith that would help Germany to respond or to live a life after Hitler. One might say that there's stuff from him that we can learn for the moment that we're living in now. But I also want to say that in regards to how many times the question is asked, where do we go from here? It was April of 1967 when Martin Luther King Jr. spoke on the subject, where do we go from here? This was after or in the context of a civil rights movement that had some significant gains and some profound setbacks. And in '67, King was not a hero in the United States. They did not like him here. He did not have a national holiday. He's asking the question, where do we go from here? '67. I want to say that in 1877, there was likely a similar question. When the Republicans pulled out of the South and allowed the South to handle Reconstruction on their own, which effectively began the road to Jim Crow that was codified national law in 1896. Perhaps they were asking that question in 1865, at the end of the Civil War, when there were people on both sides claiming faith as the reason for murdering. I should say murder in the, I would call murder actually the accurate call or the accurate description of what the Confederates were doing in an effort to keep slaves, led by God. What is going on with this recurring question, contemplation? We stand in a history of trying to figure out what it means to be Christian in this space, on this soil. And I would add Bonhoeffer into that because he's building on a Western idea of human being and of Christian faithfulness. What he's dealing with is not foreign to what we're dealing with. It is a European iteration that was also present in South Africa. Where do we go from here? Recognize first that we are not an ahistorical people. We are the accumulation of the people and the movements that happened well before us. Where are we at this moment in that history? I have a tremendous amount of hope at this moment, not just because my ancestors have gone through stuff like this in the past. People say, you know, our ancestors went through this, I shouldn't have to go through this. I get that. But they did not have the work that people have already done in facing those moments that we can rely on. That there are people who in facing these questions, in facing the traumas that we are continuing to face, they have thought about it, they have prayed about it, they have written about it. You quote them, you read them, you cite them. No matter what they're doing in this moment to try and reverse those gains, they can't stop that movement that began hundreds of years ago, and on whose shoulders we stand. I cite them in my work. I read them. You are here in large part because of that history. And I also want to reiterate what Reverend Blackmon is saying. They help to paint a picture of what we are for, not just what we're against. So long as we are in the mode of reaction, you don't have a clear sense of your own identity. Who is this Jesus you claim to love?
Thank you. That's great. Thank you. John, I know that you're a pastor in Cary and we just connected, but I know who you are and that you take this stuff really seriously as a pastor. And I want to ask you a question as someone who is bound up in the local community, the local body. After the Covenant school shooting in Nashville, my little scrappy organization began to give food to people, give money to people because people were staying at home, not getting out, with the rise of violence against anybody who is different. And you, as a pastor, have tackled these issues in your local congregation, and as Reggie commented, had some probably profound steps forward and some significant steps back. But you are stewarding the body in a particular way. And I'm just wondering, could you help us put some words to this question, where do we go from here? Because you're a living testament of where we're going from here.
Well, thank you. I'm incredibly honored to be in a conversation with all three of you. You're all three just incredible leaders that I just have tremendous respect for. And mostly I want to just kind of sit at your feet and learn and listen. And so I'm really grateful for the opportunity just to participate in the conversation. I think to what both Traci and Reggie both have shared of, I think it's so critical for the church when we think about moving forward that we are part of a movement that is a death, burial, and resurrection movement. And as we think about moving forward, there are things in our movement, in the structures, in the systems of the church that need to die and that need to be resurrected. And many times we've talked about in these types of spaces, many times in progressive type of spaces, where it is, let's deconstruct the theology and the ideas, and that has its place, but the systems have to be deconstructed. And the structures and the hierarchies and the way that we have gone about doing things and who we have been learning from and listening to, those things in many of our spaces have to die, and yet many of us want to cling to, and I see this trend in many different churches right now, especially more progressive communities, where they want the structures to all stay the same and the systems to all stay the same, and yet just replace the ideas and not realizing that, many of those need to die as well and needs to be resurrected into something new. And that's scary and that's challenging, but I think that needs to be a part of our way forward. I think when we talk about in our local communities, I think another thing that I so appreciate what Traci was sharing as well on the how we respond and staying who we are for rather than just who we are against. But I also think part of our movement needs to not be filled with so much snark and contempt for people that disagree with us. And so when we talk about being what we are for, yes, we need to be angry. There are things to be angry about, and there are things to speak out about and to be bold about. But the snark and the contempt that often comes along with it to those that would oppose us is actually undermining the very message that we're trying to say that we're for. So I think we need to continue to find ways to be about justice, and to be about justice in all the ways, economic justice and racial justice and gender justice and all the different facets of that. But when there is pushback, I think the snark that happens in progressive spaces oftentimes, in the contempt, is undermining the very message of what we're trying to say that we're for. And so to specific things that, Roberto, you raised about school shootings, I think we have to think differently even as how we respond to the church and how we show up in those moments. And thinking differently for us, as an example, one of the things in our community that several people had rallied around, that in light of those things in North Carolina, two of our two senators here, our two U.S. senators, are two of the three most funded by the NRA. And so we then took a Sunday morning in response to one of the school shootings and said, you know what, we've done all the thoughts and prayers, we've done the silent moments, and we've done all the things and tried to help provide different things here and there to people. But, okay, there is a game that has to get played in engaging with politics, and an important game of saying, how do we engage? Because this is where policy happens. This is where change happens. And I think many of our churches, I grew up in a context in the evangelical world that was like, you don't talk about, even though the moral majority was, very large and looming back in the 80s, but we don't really talk about politics in the church. It's subtle how we do it, and we don't really talk about it, and because it's too divisive. Well, that whole thing blew up, but for here in the last, 7 or 8 years especially. But we've got to figure out, how do we engage in political systems at the local politic level especially? And so for us, it was, okay, well, let's take a whole Sunday morning. We need to model for our people what a phone call to your senator looks like. So here's a script. So we took the Sunday morning and said, we're going to model a phone call for what your senator looks like. So we called them, put it on the speakerphone. let everyone hear, gave everyone a script, and then said, and now we're going to spend the rest of the time, we need you to do that now. Not when you go home, not when, just think about this later. Here's the script. Everybody go throughout the building, grab your cell phone now. Here's the script, make the call. Here's how you write the letters. Here's how you do that. This is what we're engaging in all the way across the board, from our youngest kids all the way to our adults. How do we engage in this type of advocacy at that moment? And it was beautiful to see, like, our church saying, okay, this is how we have to engage in this way, because that's intimidating and scary to do that. And that's not something that a lot of people maybe I'd even thought about doing maybe necessarily in a church service, but we have to figure out how to engage these systems differently. And then those two senators were part of the 10 that came together in the U.S. Senate to make some compromises and make some progress forward on gun laws in our country with some background checks. Now, our church wasn't the one to say, there were plenty of people that were involved in that, but in this community, we're like, okay, we're going to flood them with several hundred phone calls and emails. And so then when the senators did come to the table, and it didn't go nearly as far as it needs to go, but it took some steps forward. So then it was, now we need to take a Sunday morning, and now I need you to call those senators and thank them. I need you to call them, and even though they stand opposed to many things that we would be for as a community, I need you to thank them for coming to the table, trying to work on that, and then we need you to, we're going to encourage you to keep taking steps. We're going to encourage you to keep challenging. And so I just think in those ways, when we look at issues, and whether that's gun violence, when we look at things of with gender and the LGBT community, and different, we have to figure out as communities how to think about the systems and structures and how we operate as a community differently, rather than just preaching different ideas from the pulpit and keeping all the same systems and structures the same as they've always been. And so I think that for us is a constant question of how do we move forward, because what does that look like? Feels like in our context, that's we're just discovering that and learning. And so listening to a lot of people, learning, sitting at the feet of a lot of others who have done that work long before us. And I think we have to put ourselves in a position where we're constantly learning and trying and experimenting new things. So.
Thank you. I try to be a lifelong learner, and so part of how I'm spending my time is rereading parts of the Bible. Some people say theologians don't pray or read the Bible, but I'm returning to my roots. And one of the things that I'm caught up with, and John, you spoke so great about how you're building this, is how do we get out of the hyper-individualism of these United States in the church and really build community and really help us reframe these relational systems that not only silo us, but accelerate individualism that really mirrors the geist of whiteness. So I'm really curious, like, how do we be this body that the Bible calls us to be? How do we become communitarian and community-minded?
I have some thoughts about that I will share briefly, and I am testing them out here with some degree of certainty because my return plane ticket is already purchased. I think we have to have a serious conversation about what church is. What is the purpose of church? I was raised in conservative religions, and I embraced this notion that church was a vehicle for salvation. I'm not sure about that. I think salvation and liberation are not the same thing. They're connected, but they're not the same. And I wonder if the purpose of church really is to build community, regardless of one's beliefs and thoughts. When I look at my sacred texts in the beginning of the church in Acts, the message is not really about what do you believe, but how are you going to live together, right? We're going to come together and pray and study. Study doesn't always mean that you're going to agree on everything. We're going to be unified. It doesn't say anything about being uniform. And then we're going to contribute from what we have so that everyone has what they need. And that's a community piece. So I want to sit that over here. to how we have created for ourselves something different for church. Church has become the police for some of us in terms of monitoring what we can do and what we can't do. It's the moral compass for some of us, all based on interpretation. So I just want to let that hang out there for a minute. I also want to talk about this notion of how we gain our understandings of God and God's work in the world, and our understandings of Jesus and Jesus' ministry. I would suggest that if we're really reading text, that we see in the text itself Jesus modeling this process of interrogating Scripture and pushing back against common notions. The whole Sermon on the Mount, though we love to talk about the blessed parts of it, it's also Jesus saying, I know you heard this, but let me have you talk about this. I know that you were taught this way, but I want to push against that and say, it also means this. These are the kind of conversations that we've stopped having in church. The pastor has become the authoritative voice for so many, and we're not having those discerning conversations as communities as we once did. I want to leave that there. Then I want to say Phyllis Tickle has done some marvelous work for me around just monitoring the rise and fall of church. And I want to say unequivocally, church is not going to die. It's never going to die. It's going to be reborn and reborn and reborn, but death for the church is not coming without resurrection. So what has been monitored is that every 500 years, there seems to be a whole collapse of what we understand church to be. I call it the falling away of doctrine, the idolization that we create, back to the basic dogma, and we start again. And then we build and we add stuff onto it, and it has to be broken down another 500 years. The good news is we're in the 500 cycle. So we're breaking down on time. I mean, I'm just saying, it's falling apart on time. And what will we do this time? To Reggie's point, what will we do this time when we began to take just the nucleus of what it means to be a follower of the way? How can we keep from adding our layers that exclude instead of include? How can we keep from doing the same thing over and over again? I love always a pastor who leads the congregation, because politics and partisanship are also not the same thing. And everyone is political. That is how we live our lives. And so when I was pastoring, much like you, I never had them call because I wasn't sure what they say. But I like that idea. What we would do is create our own grid, and at the top of the grid, we would put those things that matter to us. Whether that was housing, for us it was always housing, it was always education, it was always race. It was not always inclusivity. It is now, but I want to be honest about that. It wasn't always at the top of our list. We'd put those across the top, and then the challenge would be, for what became a ministry in our church, is to find the theological support for what you are saying the church believes. That's the next little column across the top. And then on the side would be all the candidates. And it was not about whether they were Republican or Democrat or liberal. It was about what they had to say about what the gospel has something to say about. And that is not telling people how to vote. It was not ours to tell you how to vote. But if this is who you say you are, and these are the principles that make you who you are, then the people that you vote into office should be the people who most closely align with those principles. That's just the bottom line. And now we are in a circle where, to be honest, we don't want to give up our comfort. And some of the things that we say are important to us may mean that something happens to our comfort so that everybody can be okay. Nadia Bose-Weber, who is one of my favorite preachers, says something that has always stuck with me. We always talk about resurrection. I love to talk about resurrection, but Jesus was resurrected in wounded body. And we don't like to talk about wounds. Not scars, wounds. I'm a nurse. Wounds so deep that he invited Thomas to put his hand inside of the wound. So resurrecting the church as a place where everyone is seen in the divine image of God is not going to be woundless. And the question is, are we courageous enough? And are we vulnerable enough to know that even though we're wounded, we will live?
Thank you.
So my contribution, I guess, to that question about creating community, I'm a professor of Christian ethics. I'm going to be thinking about, or talking, or actually, let me just start with this. I'll be thinking about what are the tools that we come to this conversation with? What are the tools at our disposal for considering this, for trying to make these things happen? The toolkit that we immediately rely on is what we believe about reality. We're dealing with, an understanding of human being as the foundation for the community that we should want. I'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow in a conversation about the Christian problem of race. But where we are right now is the accumulation, as I've already said, of the history that's passed before us. Time is not so much linear as one scholar describes it as crumpled. We exist in a crumpled time that history is in the present with us, not in the past, but it is here with us right now. And we'd like to think that in those days we would have done this. If I had been there, I would have done this. How do we discern, given the moment that we're in right now, the connection to what was and what you're going to do, how you're going to be? This is the question that we face. I mentioned post-Civil War. We recognize that time is crumpled, not linear. There is something present here right now that was. After the Civil War, one side believing they had lost and were upset, another side believing they had won and they're victorious. Now that slavery has ended, what is this faith? What does the faith do? This is abolitionist Christianity. And the tradition that I come from is a black abolitionist tradition of faith. That God is concerned about embodied conditions in this world right now, your well-being in your body. What does abolitionist faith look like post-Civil War? This is the tradition that I'm in. These immoral Christians, of course, lots of Christians would call them immoral, lawbreakers, plundering an economy, demanding that they have some response that is law-abiding. Given that history is present with us as the structures themselves were undone, but the ideologies were not, the reality that a community is holding on to, that they believe is not just good for the economy, but also God's work in the world. how do I discern what we are about and how to move forward here? I mean, the question is about community. And it is multiple, it's so layered when we're talking about this. There are lots of communities that I want nothing to do with, that we should not have much to do with, because they coalesce around a concept of reality that is harmful. But to find your community, I mean here, obviously, around which you understand that history, past and present, is a space for activity around certain kind of faith, right? A certain kind of good, a certain kind of faith. What we might say as, I mean, I see it on t-shirts here on justice and so forth, but let me just stop there. I could keep going on this, but I don't want to reveal too much about what I'm going to say tomorrow, or you're not going to come.
So that's a cue. Go to Reggie's session tomorrow. What time is it?
1 o'clock, I believe.
1 o'clock
the
tomorrow.
Christian problem, I think it's 1, I think. Is it 1? Yeah. Yes.
Reggie's session.
Oh, at the somebody said forum. Forum, yeah, thank you.
In the forum, yes. So I'm so glad you brought up this word abolition, because I think through the lens of abolition and fugitivity and whatnot, and I'm aware that we are each marginalized in some way. And when I think about abolition, I'm thinking about life-affirming systems. And that God is concerned, God always has life in front of God. The God of the Gospels is a God of life, and a God of ethical futures and so forth. And so I'm aware that, John, your particular marginalization has been the profound loss, but the gain of a particular kind of community at your church, and you are stewarding your time as a pastor in helping your congregants participate in life-affirming systems by teaching them how to call their senators, right? And they're each doing that, stewarding our vocation to help create life-affirming systems. So I'm wondering if we say that the church is going to be a wounded body but always resurrected. Resurrection calls life, right? And so what does that new life of a wounded body, what is the condition of a life-affirming system? If that is the road that we're on, right, this 500-year cycle, what are those life-affirming systems that we need to infuse? Housing, certainly, and whatnot, but what are some other examples of the next iteration of life for the church?
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
I think maybe to start at a small level and then maybe work our way out. But to that community question, I live in the world of pastoring a local community and thinking about the disciplines to your first question, which I think was so important. We see so much of the individualistic pursuit of God. I had a conversation last week with someone who said, you know what, I used to be able to come into Sunday morning years ago, and I had the connection with the worship leader on stage, and the lights were dark, and I felt like I could connect with them and with God and have this very individual, focused, reflective time with God, and I missed that. And I wanted to honor that because that's true, but we've now designed everything in our system and our structure, the way the seats are, to how the lights are, to we put people in groups for 20 to 30, 20 minutes during the service to have conversations and to talk. And so, and to be able to say that I grew up in a structure that said, here's what it looks like. Here's the disciplines that you put. Here's the life structures. You have your quiet time that's 15 minutes, and you pray and you read your Bible and you serve somewhere on Sunday mornings and within the church on Sunday mornings, whether working with the kids or as a greeter. And then maybe if you're really spiritual, then maybe you're a part of a small group or something during the week where you go and you talk about the Bible again. And all of those things have their great benefit and good. But the person was reacting negatively to, well, my spouse and they don't like the getting together in groups for 15 minutes, and they don't want to come in. They're an introvert, and they just don't want to be in that space, and which I understand. We've said, if you just want content, you can listen online. There's plenty of content online. Even in our community, you can listen. But if you come here, then this is for community. And so trying to then say that's worth a 10 to 15 minute discipline, spiritual discipline in our lives to put ourselves in front of other people, that it might be uncomfortable for you. And always reminded that we're commanded to love one another. If it just came naturally and easy, right, then we probably maybe wouldn't do that all the time. But we're commanded by this Jesus that we follow to love one another. And so when it starts at the small systems and structures of our church and then goes out to say, yes, how do the systems that we participate in, we have to engage in education on race, on housing, on legislation that is affecting people. So those systems in terms of a life-giving community, there are many people in our community who weren't aware of the laws affecting transgender people in North Carolina and around the country. So we're like, okay, well, we need to bring in a few different experts to come in who live in that world and then teach and equip our community to say, you need to be aware of these things. You need to understand how these policies are affecting people and all the different points of view on it. Or whether that's housing and affordable housing, like that is a system to go, not only do you need to participate in that, but now you also need to learn the legislation behind it. You need to learn how to advocate. We need to do those things because, again, those systems, those matter to create a community of going, because it's not just the community of the people, it's how do we create community with, to your greater point, Roberto, of everyone in our community, of everyone that, and especially those that have been marginalized, especially those who have been hurt and wounded and oppressed in the name of, across our nation right now, oftentimes Christianity. So how are we building community and how are we modeling that we care about that? And so those systems, that's the stuff that's happening all during the week oftentimes, to me, are the bigger systems that we have to take advantage of outside of the system of just Sunday morning and figuring out how are we creating those kind of life-giving communities. So.
Thank you. Tracy?
The most life-giving thing I know that humans can give other humans is to fully see one another. I would that we would see one another. There isn't a time when I spend time actually listening to someone, whether their story agrees with me or not, that we are not both transformed. Not listening so that I can respond and defend, but listening to hear another story. Not multitasking, but looking a person in their eyes and giving them your full attention is life-giving and life-saving. So rarely do we give people our attention that if you fully give your attention to someone, they will spontaneously begin to discharge, which looks like crying because we are that starved to be seen. So I would say that that is the life-giving piece for me, that we take time to see people, not just inside our buildings, but in our surrounding neighborhood. I'll say this and I'll be quiet because that is it for me. That when I began to pastor Christ the King, which is the church from which I ended up being involved in Ferguson, when I came to that church, and maybe this is like some of your churches, the people who were actually members there did not live in the community. They had once lived in the community, but they had gotten better jobs, they made more money, they moved further out. There's nothing wrong with that, but they were driving into the community for worship. And for them, the people inside the building became the community. So when we went canvassing in the neighborhood, which is what I required, there was no connection. So we changed in that moment. The question became, okay, we know how to do church. but do we know how to be a neighbor? And being a neighbor made us proximal to the pain of people in the community where our church was lodged that was not a part of our everyday existence because we drove out to places where we didn't have to worry about that. If the church begins to see one another, and not just inside our buildings, but see one another in the communities that we are called collectively to serve, I believe we can transform this world. I believe that with all my heart. That those you don't love, that you don't agree with, if you can listen to their stories and share your stories authentically, it'll make a difference.
Thank you. Any last words?
Amen. Yeah, amen. One thought that comes to mind again, additionally, that comes with this question of community. Back to our understanding of who we are as humans. We live within a current reality that values individual as a rational thinking single person based on your buying power. And this was, in fact, the product of a set of folks who imagined this world, coming out of Europe, who you must repeat in order to be educated. I would say that it's important to recognize that you actually come into existence as a being based on connection. That after you are born, you cannot survive at any point alone. That we are made for, we come into existence by and for connection. Scholars are talking today about the connection between quantum entanglement and a study of human beings. That we are always already connected. And that is a better understanding of who and what we are. So a faith system based on merit and you and Jesus isn't a representation of who you actually are. What if we have a faith system that recognizes that you are always already connected at the beginning, from the start? And that love your neighbor is a representation of healthy you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. That's good.
Any last word, John?
No, I would say, I think that's a really great place for us to end. And I will leave then, I guess, with the words of, if it's love, that loving God for us is loving your neighbor, and that Jesus said that. And so let's keep figuring that out. Let's keep loving your neighbor. And
Thank you.
really grateful for what you guys shared.
Thank you each for this. It's been great.